Committee Room 29, signed. 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 Committee Room 29. Sound. 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 Committee Room 29, signed. 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 Committee Room 29. Sound. 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 Committee Room 29, signed. 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 Committee Room 29. 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 Signed. Committee Room 29, 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 signed. Committee Room 29. 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 Signed. Committee Room 29, 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 Sound. 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 Committee Room 29, Sound.
Very much. That's you confirmed open.
Thank you. Good morning, members. Can I welcome all members to this meeting of the Committee for Communities? Can I remind anyone in the public gallery that mobile phones must be turned off. Mobile tablet devices can, however, be used through a Wi-Fi connection, and all devices should be muted. Passport details are available in the gallery for anyone wanting to connect to the Assembly's Wi-Fi network. No recordings or photographs are to be taken. May I remind members about the protocols regarding the use of electronic devices? Switch all mobile devices to airplane mode and activate Wi-Fi connection. Please also use tablet devices discreetly and in a way which does not interfere with proceedings, and be aware of the cameras when using the tablet device. And I would also like to remind you once again about the sensitivity of the microphones. Finally, I would remind members of your responsibility to declare any interest in any of the items under discussion today. So does any members have any interest to declare? No, thank you. I'm going to move on to item 1 on the agenda, apologies. We have apologies from Colin Gildernew, Kelly Armstrong, Andy Allen, Morris Bradley,
Daniel McCrossen.
and Daniel McCrossen. Okay, thank you. As members aware of any other apologies? I think that's well, yeah. Members, as we have not received a quorum here today, I'm going to move on to item number 2, chairperson's business. And there is no chairperson's business to report. I just, first of all, I suppose on behalf of all members of the committee and staff, we wish to offer our sincere condolences on behalf of the committee and the staff to the chairperson and his wider family following the tragic death of his nephew, Fikra, over the weekend. I'm going to move on to item 3. As we do not have a quorum, I'm going to defer the draft minutes, if that's okay. Yeah. And we'll move on to item 4. And once again, obviously, as we do not have a quorum here today, we can't make any decisions on any of the correspondence that we have in the pack. If members would be content that we will defer that correspondence to next week's meeting. Yeah, okay. So I'm now going to move members on to agenda item number 5, and it's the departmental briefing on the budget. So we'll just await our guests to arrive. And just for members, your briefing paper for this agenda item starts at page 132, and there is a tabled paper at page 14 on the June monitoring. And can I welcome both Sherry and Gavin to the meeting today, and really appreciate that you're coming in early. It's much appreciated by members. So just welcoming Sherry Arnold, who is the Finance Director, and Gavin Patrick, the Finance Director. Sherry, I invite you to make a brief opening statement, 5-10 minutes. Just before then we can move to members for any questions. Is that okay?
Thank you.
Thank you, Sherry.
Good morning, Chair and committee members. Thank you for the opportunity for myself and my colleague Gavin Patrick to brief you today on the Department's 24-25 budget position and June monitoring. We've provided a written brief on June monitoring on Monday, and details on Minister for Communities' initial budget 24-25 decisions and planned EQIA was provided yesterday. I apologise for the late issuing of the papers. This has been due to the extensive work that's been ongoing with regards to the Department's budget allocations. I'll now provide a brief summary of the budget position, the challenges this presents for the Department this year, and after this Gavin and I would be happy to take any questions. The Executive set the budget on the 25th of April. In the written ministerial statement which accompanied the budget, the Finance Minister outlined that no department had received the level of funding that it bid for. The Executive's budget allocation provides the Department with 856 million of resource, 133.4 million of net capital and 29.8 million of financial transactions capital. The Department's allocation includes 175 million of Executive earmarked funding and 681 of non-ring-fenced resource. Earmarked allocations have been provided in full for welfare mitigations, housing benefit rates, D-rating grant, the Office of Building Safety and Peace Plus. That will enable these provisions to continue this year without cut or any adverse impact. With regards to non-ring-fenced resource, the Department submitted 128.8 million of bids and was provided with a general allocation of 13. This has resulted in the Department facing 115.8 million or a 17% shortfall in non-ring-fenced resource. On capital, the Department received a net allocation of 133.4. the net capital allocation results in £167.3 million, or 48.5% shortfall in the capital bid submitted. Financial transaction capital of £29.8 million is aligned with forecasted need. This will support loans or equity investments in capital projects, including continuation of co-ownership affordable housing. In addition to the Executive's budget allocation, which is outside the scope of our equality impact assessment, the Department's annually managed expenditure budget totals £9.7 billion. This budget provides for the Department's Social Security benefit and pension payments to customers, and a breakdown of our AME budget is provided in our briefing. With regards to the Executive's budget allocations, managing shortfalls of £115.8 million in resource and £167.3 million in capital will undoubtedly impact on the Department's ability to deliver public services in 24-25. Since the Department received its 24-25 budget allocations, there's been extensive work carried out to consider the actions required to live within the Department's constrained allocations. In managing the budget 24-25 allocations, Minister has firstly considered internal reductions and cuts on the Department's own functions to protect others, prior to the need to considering the Department's funded arm's-length bodies and third-party organisations. In light of the extremely challenging position and significant shortfall faced, to protect core service delivery, the Department's resource allocations will reflect the following decisions. Firstly, the departmental vacancy control, with 695 critical vacancies, predominantly related to Social Security benefit and pensions delivery, not being filled this year. This position reflects a 16% increase on the 600 vacancies not filled last year. Secondly, the Minister recognises the vital role the voluntary community sector plays, and given pressures on the sector, voluntary community sector funding will increase this year by £1.45 million. Minister also acknowledges the hugely important role of the Northern Ireland Housing Executive in addressing homelessness and delivering the Supporting People programme in Northern Ireland. Minister will commit to holding homelessness funding at 23-24 final EQA levels and provide a 4.8 increase in funding for the Supporting People programme to help ensure the continued viability of the programme. With regards to the Department's arm's-length bodies who carry out a range of important functions and deliver on the Department's strategic objectives, despite a heavily constrained finance position, the Department's arm's-length bodies funding will be held at last year's final EQA decision funding level. Given many people face financial hardship, the Department's discretionary support budget will be topped up to £22 million. This reflects a 10% increase on the 23-24 final EQA budget position. Additionally, employment is seen as the best route out of poverty, and the Minister places significant value on the collaborative and partnership working arrangements in place with councils to provide employment interventions at local level. Subject to business case approvals, the Minister commits to continue labour market partnership funding with councils. Given the scale of the financial challenges faced, however, the 24-25 rate support grant provided to councils will be set at £3.1 million. This reflects a £1.8 million reduction on the grant provided in 23-24. In the absence of resource bids being met for similar parity delivery in 24-25, the Department will be unable to progress, firstly, an extension of its very successful Job Start scheme for young people aged 16 to 24 and other parity employment support. Furthermore, given the continued year-on-year squeeze on budgets, the Department will undertake further review of its existing employment programmes and their continued viability. And whilst plans were developed to increase investment in tackling rising levels of welfare fraud and error, in the absence of additional funding and heavily constrained budgets, this additional investment will not proceed at this time. In addition to these initial decisions, the Department has a resource funding gap of almost £11 million to manage in year, which is the equivalent of funding required for 300 staff. Further additional actions will be progressed in year, including minimising all discretionary spend, considering further estates rationalisation, redeploying staff where necessary to protect core service delivery, continual review of our resource budgets, and submitting bids in the monitoring rounds and consideration of any other funding sources available. Table 1 in your pack provides a breakdown of the Department's initial 24-25 resource budget allocations. With regards capital, considering the extremely challenging capital position after inescapable requirements are met, we consider proactive measures to manage the position in tandem with managing a 10 million over planning position. Only 22 million of funding is available for other high priority capital projects. To maximise the use of the available budget, the Department's capital allocations will reflect the following decisions. Firstly, 15 million will be allocated to new build social homes. This allocation, with capital funding for shared housing, will allow for up to 400 new build social home starts in 24-25. This is a significant reduction on the 1,508 started in 23-24, but is a direct result of the significant reduction in capital funding allocated to the Department for 24-25. 2 million will be allocated to affordable warmth. This would allow approximately 360 additional approvals to be made in 24-25. The remaining department allocations will be allocated 3.3 million to urban regeneration for projects to create town and city centres where people want to live, work, shop or visit, and 1.7 million across a wide range of cultural heritage and active community projects to help and promote health and wellbeing across all Section 75 groups. Table 2 in your briefing provides a breakdown of the Department's initial 24-25 capital budget allocations. Given the magnitude of the resource and capital shortfalls facing the Department in 24-25 and the adverse impact this will have on people in Section 75 groups and a quality impact assessment on the Department's 24-25 budget is necessary. Following the Minister's announcement yesterday on the initial budget 24-25 allocations, the draft budget EQIA will launch on Tuesday, the 11th of June. A copy has provided to committee in advance of launch. The draft EQIA presents Minister's initial decisions to live within the Department's allocations and the potential impact to people in Section 75 categories of those decisions on the services and supports the Department provides. Throughout 24-25, the Minister will strive to deliver the best possible outcomes for people and the communities within the Department's available resource and capital funding envelope. The Minister deeply regrets that the extremely challenging budget position poses significant risk for service delivery and also acknowledges that further decisions may be required in year to live within budget or to mitigate the initial budget 24-25 allocations. The draft EQIA will be published on the Department's internet site and will run for a 12-week period. All responses received during the consultation period will be considered and used to inform Minister's final decisions on 24-25. The final decision report with regards to 24-25 allocations is expected to be available in October 24. Minister has not taken the Department's budget 24-25 initial decisions lightly and will continue to press for additional funding at every opportunity to ensure the well-being of everyone and every sector the Department supports. As a result, in June monitoring, 115.8 million of resource bids have been submitted. These bids are aimed at addressing key issues such as social security benefit delivery, homelessness, housing, culture, arts, heritage and other programmes. And with regards capital, 180.6 million of capital bids have been submitted, primarily to address social housing need, but also include bids for affordable warmth, residential building safety, public realm, culture, arts and heritage. Additionally, 15 million of bids have been submitted for non-cash cover for depreciation and impairments. Given the challenging budget position faced in this current financial year, no reduced requirements are forecast. Our June monitoring briefing provides detail on the additional bids submitted by the Department. I hope you have found our briefing informative, and Gavin and I are happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Sherry. Thank you, Gavin. I suppose first and foremost, shocked and aghast at the statement here this morning. And obviously we're aware of how serious and challenging the budget is. And I suppose quite alarming for me is particularly housing. And did I hear that with the current budget and the money now available and the decision made by the Minister, we are saying 400 homes?
Up to 400 homes.
Up to 400 homes, when the target figure that we were hoping to achieve is back to 22-23, which is 2050. And we had been doing so well the department's been doing so well with our housing associations this past 2 years in meeting targets. I know there was concerns regarding the rural housing and targets there, but it's quite alarming. And I do appreciate, obviously, there will be bids in now for the June monitoring round. But I think we would all agree that it's quite alarming given our level of housing need, our level of homelessness, the amount of people we currently have in temporary accommodation. So I would just like to make that comment. Now, I do appreciate and I do welcome yesterday's announcements by the Minister, particularly in relation to obviously the community and voluntary sector, who we've had presentations to, and we know the valuable work that they do on the front line in our communities. And then likewise supporting people, and I know support people have been in with the committee members and have met with the Minister on that. With regards to the supporting people budget, 4.8 million, I know obviously the bid was 12.6, and can there be any insights or any clarity as to the flexibility with that 4.6 that can be utilised by the delivery agents that we have in supporting people? Suppose that would be one question, particularly can be backdated to like the 1st of April. Uplifts in salaries is a key thing because it's about supporting those, as we know, and what we've heard, serious concerns regarding salary levels and how we retain our staff, qualified and experienced staff in that field, supporting our most vulnerable people. So it'll be interesting to hear that. Discretionary support. Obviously we welcome there is some increase, 10%, but I know obviously the projections even, and we know, back 2 years ago it was up at 40 million. It has reduced, obviously. There's a kind of prediction of 27 million this year, so still a quite shortfall. So in numbers, it'd be useful to know, would you have an idea of, with the 23 million and based on the demand, what are we thinking numbers of people that could not be able to be assisted given cost of living and the demands on household incomes at this moment in time? As we've seen over the past 2 years, it's been increasing. So that's a couple of questions that I would have in the first instance, if that's okay, and then I'll also open it to the members of the floor. So thank you.
You take the supporting people question.
Yes, I'll take supporting people. So NAHE delivered the supporting people programme on behalf of the department. We'll be working with Housing Executive as to how best that funding can be used and how flexible it can be used with the providers, so that they can deliver the service. So that piece of work obviously now needs to be taken forward now that the Minister's making those decisions. Mm-hmm. So certainly we'll look at what flexibilities can be made available throughout the year.
On discretionary support, last year in 23-24, spend on grants was just over 27 million, and on loans was 11 million. On grants, it allowed almost 45,000 grants to be paid out and 41,000 loans to be issued. With regards to the grant budget this year, obviously being set to 22, we've seen a slight decrease in demand. We are forecasting the requirement there at the minute, and it is demand-led, somewhere between 22 to 25 at the minute. Again, we don't need all of that money at the start of the financial year. We look to see how that budget, spend against that budget continues over the remainder of the financial year. But we do expect that there could be some pressures on that budget towards the end of the financial year.
I'll open it to members. Lawrence?
Yep. Go ahead.
I just thought you wrote Sherry, because Gavin, you're very welcome. First thing I'd like to express to the Chair is just my disappointment of sort of hearing this information for the first time now at the meeting. And I don't see how I can nearly reasonably be expected to examine it, given the short notice. And I often wonder that when dealing in particular with this type of report, and the complexities not of it, that a committee should receive it in a whole lot sooner than, we'll say, just hearing it now for the first time. But in saying that, in relation to the capital funding shortfall and so on, could you outline for us at the minute just maybe which capital projects are to be delayed or possibly even cancelled?
Well, Minister made, first of all, to address your first point about the timing, I suppose we brought the information as soon as possible after Minister's decisions were made, and obviously there is time now as part of the consultation to provide further feedback, but obviously we take on board the point that you have made. In relation to capital, really it is the vast majority, as the paper sets out, the vast majority of the schemes being taken forward are the inescapable bids. Minister has provided some funding to high priority bids, and maybe if I outline those, that's probably a way of looking at that, such as in regeneration space. There's regeneration in Botanic, Duncairn, the Strabane Public Realm project is planned to be moving forward as well this year, so there's funding for that. And in other areas such as Glengormley and Ard. So those were high priority, not inescapable, but ministers agreed that funding can go forward with that. In relation to the culture, arts and heritage area, you've got programmes such as the Arts Small grants, Your School, Your Club, Blackie Bawn, and musical instrument schemes within that space that funding has been provided for. And also then there's an element of the funding that goes towards those 400 homes was high priority and not inescapable, and £15 million have been provided for it, an additional £2 million for affordable warmth. So that only allows the vulnerable people's application forms for affordable warmth within this year, and as Jerry had said, about 360 applications, new applications within this year. So that would mean outside the majority of those, the other schemes wouldn't be able to be taken forward. So if you want more detail on the other high priority lists, we can look at providing that to you rather than.
Just can I confirm with you then, you alluded to the Strabane Public Realm scheme.
Yeah.
Has that been completed yet, the work by the department for it to be submitted to finance?
So the funding has been set aside by the Minister. The business case process is still being worked through, but the budget now has Ministers provide budget to allow that scheme to start this year once the approvals are all in place.
So that's going to happen?
Once all the approvals are in place of budget, I think the positive point here is the fact that the budget has been set aside as a high priority bid.
Right. And I know too, with all respect, that you outlined those projects that are either moving forward or that are likely to happen and so on, but the question that I asked was in relation to those that have been either delayed or cancelled.
So there would be a longer list of high priority bids, and we can provide that to the committee if you're content, rather than read them through all here, if that's okay.
I appreciate that.
Yeah. Okay.
Margaret.
Okay, Morris?
Okay, thank you, Chair. Again, it's first I've heard that level of detail, so thank you for providing it, but it is very concerning. I'm aware, obviously, the settlement for the department in the budget was a real term cut, and in terms of increase, the Minister's 129 million bid and only a 13 million allocation, so it was just around 10%, of what was actually sought. So there are no easy decisions working within that budget that has been set from the executive. So in a situation, there's some good news for some sections, but there's a lot of bad news working within the budget allocated for the department. So a few questions. Well, I'll mention a few things first. I suppose on a positive, pleased to see that an increase of voluntary and community sector. We've heard from neighbourhood renewal groups where funding has been frozen many times over the years, an occasional increase, but still in a position, I understand, where the current contract is only up to the end of this month. So I don't know whether we asked this question last week and we were told the funding allocation for the rest of this financial year has yet to be allocated. So, as I say, groups are now down to 4 weeks of funding left with staff on protective notice. Is there any progress on that? It's getting beyond critical for those projects. They'll be losing good staff if they cannot guarantee funding for past the end of this month. But as I say, I note that there is an increase there for volunteering community sector, also an increase for the Supporting People programme, and we're all aware of the important work that does for vulnerable people who are homeless and in challenging circumstances. The discretionary support grants, an increase too, and maintaining support for labour market partnerships, working to help people into employment and highlight opportunities. But particular concern on capital funding for social housing. Now, I'm looking between the two documents here about further bids for the June monitoring round. So, yeah, looking between the two papers, so is the current allocation only, I know you've answered this already, but I just want to get clarity. The current allocation for new social homes will only permit, as things stand, 400 new social homes this year, or is that an increase of 400, or is it a 400 total?
400 new starts this year.
Total?
So some of the budget, about 100 million of the budget for social housing development programme this year is for the TALs coming forward from last year and to finish the completion of those homes. So the additional funding that ministers put forward, the 15 million, will allow the additional new starts of about 400 new homes.
Right, but between the budget allocation, the current budget allocation for this year, and then what's been put in for the June monitoring round, would that potentially enable, in addition to the 400 new social homes to start?
If the June monitoring bids were met, yes, that would bring us up, certainly up towards the target. As the Chair had mentioned, the target of around 2,000 new homes. That's only if that bid was met.
Yes.
And obviously that there'll be competing bids from other departments as well.
Yes, aye. Oh no, and there's no guarantees. But
so that's what we've looked for. We have looked to try and get that funding. Whether or not we get it, it's up to the executive.
The current budget allows for 400 new starts in year, and the bid to the monitoring round would aim to take that up to 2,000. Okay. And in terms of the positions not being filled, can you give us those totals again? I mean, because again, we have heard at various stages the impact of vacancies. And you mentioned there, for example, in welfare, either mistakes or fraud taking place within welfare allocation, the a lack of resources going into that. How is the vacancies within the department, how has that been managed? It must be impossible, nearly.
It's very difficult. In terms of overall staffing levels in the department at the minute, we have, at April, we had 9,684 staff in post. And at that point in time, we had 1,391 declared vacancies.
How many?
1,391 declared vacancies. 859 of those actually relate to DWP funded work. That's a really good news story for the department. There's been agreements put in place that we staff up to 4,500 staff delivering services for GB in the department. Brings additional jobs into Northern Ireland and over £95 million into the Northern Ireland economy.
In what, sorry? In what section?
For work, delivering services for Department of Work and Pensions in GB. Yeah. So we've agreements in place to bring in up to 4,500 by I think it's March 25, which is why a lot of those vacancies exist, and there will be funding from DWP to cover that. But as I said, good news story for the department, brings over £95 million into the Northern Ireland economy, and that increases jobs and the vacancies are filled. With regards to obviously our own service delivery within Northern Ireland and the department's own functions and work being taken forward, we have 532 declared vacancies at the point in time. And aware that our PermSec and Gillian Morton as well too, Deputy Secretary from Corporate Services Group, has previously briefed. If we were to deliver on optimum levels, our vacancy level in the Department for Northern Ireland funded work would be in the region of around about 1,100. Obviously at the minute we can't increase our headcount with the budget that we've got, and we hadn't proposed to fill all of those posts. The budget that we've been set this year means that since last March to now there's been a further reduction of 65 vacancies in the department, plus the 600 from last year. We can't fill those, and to the end of the financial year we are forecasting further attrition. We need to reduce our headcount in the department by around about, on the Northern Ireland funded work, by around about 30 staff. We think we can do that through attrition, and that's something that will be very closely monitored as the year progresses. And it's as a result of our budget position being so constrained.
Mm-hmm.
It is having, as I said, impacts on our ability to maintain parity with Department of Work and Pensions, particularly for benefit delivery. As I mentioned, we have an AME budget this year of 9.7 billion. We need the funding for the staff to deliver those benefits. We can't put an additional investment in place to deliver and tackling fraud and error. Similar to DVP, they staffed up to put an extra 6,000 staff in post. We were hoping to put another around about 170 in post to do that work. We can't take that forward. But there's also impacts right across the department. We can't take forward the work that we need on our historic sites. We can't take forward cataloguing work in Prony. We can't take forward a range of other policy work in the department. And I'm aware previously there was some briefing provided on the impacts of not filling vacancies.
Right. Yeah, so there are areas of work that are on hold, as well as just staff trying to cope with being understaffed.
Yes.
In various across sections.
We may have to, as I mentioned in my opening statement, we will have to look at some areas of redeployment this year just to protect core services.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I welcome that, you know, the DWP post coming to Northern Ireland. That's like we're importing jobs, effectively working in GB, but those posts are to work on GB rated work then, or can any of them be deployed to tasks in Northern Ireland? No.
We do it on a full cost recovery basis, so DWP pay us obviously to deliver services on their behalf. As I said, good news story for us, and it provides jobs here. We can't redeploy them to work on Northern Ireland. We're delivering services for them, and they pay for what we deliver.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Mark. Brian.
Okay.
Also, I wrote the wrong name down.
Okay.
Thank you, Brian. And we're going to move on to Cyan, who's online.
Yeah, thanks very much, Chair, Deputy Chair. I would share the Deputy Chair's concern for what we have heard today, particularly the pressures on social housing. I don't think there's been a week that's went past where we haven't discussed this. So I have a few questions here. The no extension to the Job Start programme. So from June of this month, will there be any support at all in place for young people to get into work post this month is the first question. The second question is the homelessness services budget has been held, but I'm aware that that also provides for some temporary accommodation outside of the supporting people budget. So is there an estimated spend on temporary accommodation outside of the remit of support people, and what impact will that have? In terms of the upfront childcare, I know that in terms of parity was 1.2 million, particularly in that move to universal credit. Is this being removed entirely? And is there any funding currently within this budget, not including any monitoring round, that will give provision for childcare, particularly for those who are trying to move into that scope of going back to work while on universal credit? In terms of the move to UC, initially we had been told that 200 additional staff would be needed. you're talking there about a reduction of 30 staff for the NI work. But I'm just wondering, in terms of the staff that are needed for the next stage, the next phase of the rollout, how will that impact on that? And then my last question then is around the arts. I find it really difficult to find a like for like in terms of last year's budget and this year's budget, just because of the different headings that they are placed under. Some include the libraries, some don't, and things like that. So I suppose for me, I'd really like to get a wee bit of clarity on what real-time reduction will be experienced across the arts, culture and heritage sectors. What reduction will the arm's length body, the Arts Council Northern Ireland, experience, and what reduction will the arm's length body of Libraries NI be likely to see? Possible. Thank you.
With regards Job Start, yes, the Job Start scheme within the department has been highly successful. Just to give some numbers, in phase 1 there was 1,701 paid opportunities, 1,452 young people completed, and of those completers 82% retained employment or moved into training or further education. It has been an excellent scheme in terms of success. It's funded this year through New Deal funding from NIO. Our Minister is writing to NIO to see can that funding continue this year. We also have a bid in the monitoring round. You are correct, if we don't receive additional funding, the scheme will have to close. It will close during the summer to new entrants. The funding that we do have in place at the minute runs until the end of the financial year, but obviously for people who have gone through the scheme either under the 6 month or the 9 month opportunities that are there, that funding has to be spent this financial year. In the absence of that, our key other programmes within the department, we do have our workable scheme, our access to work. We have labour market partnerships with councils that provide a level of support, but nothing directly targeted for young people within the department. With regards upfront childcare, it's obviously a requirement now as part of UC. It's parity as well too with DWP, and it removes a barrier for people returning to work or moving into employment. It has to be funded this year, so we've put a bid in it for the monitoring round. It's a pressure at the minute the department is having to deal with. So it will continue this year with statutory obligation to do that. And as you'll see, there's a monitoring round bid submitted for the funding that's needed for upfront childcare this year of 1.2 million. We were able to absorb that last year within our budgets, but the levels of requirement for upfront childcare have increased, particularly too with the move to universal credit. And then with regards move to UC, with regards to vacancies, we can't increase our headcount within the department this year. As I've mentioned already, we need to reduce by 30. We will have to continue to move to UC with the existing staff and headcount within the department. It will pose significant challenges in terms of delivery of that. And in our bids that have been submitted in the June monitoring round, we've submitted bids for £33.5 million for social security benefit delivery staffing.
Okay. In relation to the homelessness question, so the forecasted requirement for this year was 44.5 million, and of that temporary accommodation costs were estimated at about 35.9 million. The funding that we have in the department isn't sufficient to cover that, and therefore there's a bid being submitted within June monitoring of 18.4 million, and we'll be working closely with the housing executive and how the homelessness interventions can be delivered. The forecasts obviously at the start of the year there's uncertainty within those, and we've got as we had last year, those coming through on the Leave to Remain scheme as well, and there's uncertainty as to how the cost from that will be seen as the year progresses. So we're working closely with the housing executive in relation to that. Regarding arm's length bodies, as Cherry had said earlier, they've been held at 23-24 levels, So I suppose real term pressures within those areas are pay increases, and there's no funding being made available for pay. The Minister did make the decision that 500,000 would be provided for book stock at the start of the year, where that wasn't able to happen at the start of last year, and funding was only able to be provided during the year. So we will continue, similar to Housing Executive with homelessness, we'll be continuing to work with the arm's length bodies in relation to the budgets and the impacts of those. And they obviously as well will no doubt feed in through the consultation on the EKIA.
Thank you for your comprehensive answers, Chair. If it's possible, I think that it could be useful for us to receive a further briefing, just when we've had time to digest some of these figures. Obviously, getting them quite late, it is quite difficult to forensically scrutinise some of these figures. I don't know whether it would be possible in terms of our time frame, but I would definitely find it useful to go through this process again once we have a chance to really dig down into some of these figures.
Okay, yeah. I suppose, it would be useful to have the further detail that's been expressed today, any further detail that you can be providing a briefing to members would be really, really useful. And just before we wrap up, there's just a couple of wee areas I just wanted to cover. Obviously, once again, I'm going to reiterate, I'm quite shocked in relation to the house build figures. Gravely concerned. And this is not a good news story today. Particularly for our housing associations. So, and I know many members have been out with our housing associations that are very keen and are working really, really hard to invest their time and resources in the development and building social and affordable homes for people. We're conscious of the waiting list, and then I'm also gravely concerned homelessness is on the rise. So I would really, really be keen to hear in the briefing paper what we need clear actions. How are we collectively going to address this? And I'm conscious this is not for you to answer in a sense of the budget, but particularly it's reiterating the core need for housing to be seen as a priority in the programme for government, and particularly the implementation of the housing supply strategy urgently needs to be brought forward. And likewise, revitalisation of the housing urgently needs to be brought forward. But just one other area that wasn't mentioned by members, climate change and sustainability. Just how would the 1.9 million bid for climate change initiatives contribute, obviously, to the targets for net zero emissions by 2050? And maybe what is the main challenges that the climate change division is going to face in achieving these goals, particularly given the current budget and the challenges?
The climate change funding that is there is a resource budget for the staffing within that team to be taken forward. And I suppose the responsibility of that team then is the development of the policies and proposals to reduce residential carbon emissions, ensuring the just transition as within the Climate Change Act. So really they'll be working forward on the residential component in the building sector, working towards that zero emissions. So that's our focus at the moment. From my perspective, again, if you need more detail on that from my colleagues, we can get that.
Just finally for me, and apologise, I told you there'd just be one. I suppose it's just another one, and obviously you did mention around the culture and arts, particularly, some of the arm's length bodies, the Arts Council NI, Libraries NI, and then also obviously the National Museums NI and stuff. 5% cut last year, no improvement. We did hear from many of the arm's length bodies and the grave concerns, particularly regarding staffing costs, as you've mentioned. So is there any work being done on how we can work with them to at least reduce, mitigate, given, and I know obviously you have a budget allocation in now, but likewise those organisations are so critical in our neighbourhoods, in our communities. Culture, arts and heritage is vitally important in supporting our neighbourhoods, communities to thrive and to improve health and well-being. So it's just reiterating the importance of that. And disappointed, but I'm conscious, challenging budget, that they are going to be sitting at the same level as last year, knowing, and so that it is a dire. So I would obviously commend that you are going to continue to liaise intensely with the sector and see what innovative ways or ways to mitigate these current impacts, and very much would hope with the bids going in for the monitoring round that area does be a key priority as well with the Minister. So thank you. And I think there's just a last question from Brian.
Yep, two just quick questions, Chair. First of all, you might be able to answer this, but is there an indication of when the outcome of the June monitoring round will be known, or is there an expected date? Just so we had more certainty, around the outcome of that.
We're not aware of the date yet and when that's likely to be agreed.
Yeah, I appreciate it's not, but there's no indication at this stage, right? And can I just ask you to recap on the staffing figures? There's a lot of figures there you were mentioning. I think, did you say the department has 9,800?
9,684 full-time equivalent staff.
Right, actually in post?
In post.
Right. And the net outcome of the current funding will be a loss of 30 staff, is that right? Is that what you were saying?
We need to reduce, within that number there's 6,242 delivering services for Northern Ireland.
Mm-hmm.
That number will need to reduce by 30 this year.
Right. And the 9,685, you also mentioned 1,391, if I got it right, vacancies.
Declared vacancies.
And
so they're with HR to fill at the minute.
Yes, so there's that level, which is, what is that as a percentage? I don't know, around 1/6 or 1/7 of posts are actually currently vacant. Is that, but are they being recruited, or are they being held as vacancies because of funding shortfall?
They've been declared to HR to fill, and the breakdown of that was there's 859 relate to Department of Work and Pensions funded work, and 532 relate to Northern Ireland. I suppose as a comparative, I'd mentioned if we were to deliver optimum service levels, that 532 should be closer to 1,100, but obviously we don't have affordability for that.
Right. Well, I'll put the question this way, sorry going on a bit. In terms of the optimum level, what the department considers it needs in terms of staffing, but there's a certain number of posts. Is it correct to say there's a certain number of posts currently aren't filled because of the budgetary situation?
Yes, that's correct.
So how many posts are currently not being recruited because of the current budgetary situation? Do you have a figure for that?
Well, the 532 declared vacancies will have to be revisited now.
Right.
And of the staff that we have in post with delivering services for Northern Ireland, we need to reduce that figure now by 30 this year. So we have no funding to progress filling of any vacancies within the department, unless it's perhaps related to attrition. Or if a temporary promotion's in place, there's an opportunity to fill that temporary promotion, but that could have a knock-on impact as well. Okay,
thank you. Thank you, Chair.
There's no other questions from members, so can I thank both Sherry Arnold and Gavin Patrick. Really, really appreciate you coming here today, and thanks also for coming a bit earlier than the news were due, so thank you very much. Okay.
Thank you.
So members, I'm just going to move on to item number 6, a departmental briefing on the Child Support Enforcement Bill. Members, the papers for the agenda item are starting at page 114. And can I welcome the following officials? Can we have is John Noble, who is Head of Social Security Policy, Legislation and Decision Making Division. Ross Agnew, who is Child Maintenance Services. Okay, so these are very much welcome. John, can I invite you to make a brief opening statement? You have about 5 to 10 minutes. Just before then we move to questions from members, so thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Chair and committee members. Thank you for allowing us to come along this morning to brief you on the Child Maintenance Enforcement Bill, which the Department is bringing forward in the Assembly. As you've said, I have policy lead responsibility for child maintenance along with some other policy areas within Social Security Policy, Legislation and Decision Making Services Directorate in the Department. and my colleague Ross Agnew is the Operational Deputy Director of the Child Maintenance Service. Currently, where the Child Maintenance Service administrative enforcement functions are inappropriate or proven ineffective in collecting of arrears owed by non-resident parents, the Child Maintenance Service must apply to the Magistrates Court to obtain a liability order. The liability order then allows the Child Maintenance Service to take forward enforcement powers through the Northern Ireland Courts and Tribunals Service. This court-based process can take up to an average of 22 weeks. Sorry, excuse me. Sorry, apologies. As part of the commitment to improve the Child Maintenance Service to secure maintenance for qualifying children, our counterparts in the Department for Work and Pensions brought forward the Child Support Enforcement Act in 2023. That Act permits the use of administrative liability orders, which improves the enforcement process by making it more straightforward and faster to recover child maintenance arrears from non-paying parents. That Act only extended to England, Scotland and Wales, and at the time it was not possible for us to be included in that legislation. To obviously maintain parity with DWP, it is now the Department's intention to bring forward a Child Support Enforcement Bill to be introduced in the Assembly later this month for the same provisions in their Act for us here in Northern Ireland. The bill itself has two clauses and one schedule. Clause 1, rules relating to liability orders. Clause 2 is the commencement and short title, and the schedule is the amendment of statutory provisions. And I'll just take you very quickly through some background to those. So Clause 1, with regards to making and varying liability orders and appealing against liability orders, outlines the amendments contained within the schedule. Clause 1 also defines the Child Support Northern Ireland Order 1991 and the Child Maintenance Act Northern Ireland 2008. Clause 2 provides for the commencement of provisions in the short title of the bill. The schedule contains provisions which amend uncommenced Articles 32M and 32N of the 1991 Order, and that's to alter the basis on which the administrative liability order is made, allows regulations under Article 32N to make provision about variation of liability orders, and requires regulations under Article 32N to make provision about appeals, whilst also repealing 2008 Act changes to the 1991 order dealing with appeals and of liability orders. The schedule also makes provision for some minor consequential technical amendments, such as adding details about the department making liability orders to the 1991 order and adding updated references. Once the bill would attain royal assent, this will allow the Child Maintenance Service to make an administrative liability order without requiring application to the Magistrates Court. The new administrative liability orders are intended to replace the existing court-based liability order process and substantially speed up the time it takes for the Child Maintenance Service to initiate its enforcement powers. The new administrative liability orders can substantially shorten the liability order process, as I said earlier, from an average of about 22 weeks down to about 6 weeks. As officials develop the proposal for the bill, there has been engagement with our counterparts in the Northern Ireland Courts and Tribunal Service. When the bill attains royal assent, obviously the Department would be bringing forward the secondary legislation, which will be required to implement and commence the proposals of the Act. Officials are undertaking the policy development work for those secondary legislation at the moment, and we expect these to come into a later stage. In developing appropriate secondary legislation, obviously officials will continue to collaborate with our colleagues in the Northern Ireland Courts Service. This will be to review to ensuring that the regulations on appeals of administrative liabilities are developed. It is expected the regulations will set out the non-resident parent's right of appeal against an administrative liability order and the period from within the right of appeal may be exercised. As with the protocol for secondary legislation, the committee will be apprised as the Department brings forward those further regulations. As a department, we are of the view that this policy proposal in the bill is a positive measure and should help improve the enforcement process and make it straightforward and faster to recover child maintenance arrears from non-paying parents. That's a summary of our bill, and we thank you for the opportunity to brief the committee, and both myself and Ross are happy to take any questions you may have.
Okay, thank you, John, and thank you both for kind of the detailed briefing that we received in the pack. I'm just going to start with a few questions, and the members may have a few questions. The briefing, in the briefing it discussed amending the uncommenced articles of the 1991 order. Could you just give us some insight as to the reasons why these aspects of the order were never commenced? And I don't think they were commenced with the equivalent in Westminster either. I suppose that's just the first one, just from reading the briefing. And then I suppose just more detail and general understanding around the administrative liability orders. See the expected reduction in processing time from enforcement actions from 22 weeks to 6 weeks. How is that? How can that be enabled? And then I suppose, will they work the same as a court order? You know, are they equivalent? So it would be kind of useful to know. And with regards to the administrative liability orders, will that improve the collection of obviously the child maintenance arrears? That's a few questions I would have to start off, so thank you.
I'll cover the commencement. Yes, obviously, we obviously brought in the powers at the time of the 1991 order and the 2008 Act. We didn't commence them because, along with our counterparts in DWP, we didn't have the process and procedures in place. And obviously then we constantly review our policies and procedures, obviously, as we go forward, and the opportunity now has actually arisen for us to actually go back and revisit that area and now bring them forward. And obviously that, as I said earlier, is in conjunction with the court service. So yeah, there is quite a bit of a time lag, but sometimes that does happen, you know, obviously as we move forward. Sometimes other priorities of policy areas take over, and obviously we'd have small numbers in terms of the liability orders, so felt probably obviously at that time it wasn't appropriate to commence those provisions, but now we obviously want to move that stage. Reduction in the 22 weeks.
Yeah, so in terms of the practicalities then, at the moment, if the service applies for a liability order, it has to go through the magistrates court. There can be, essentially it's just the actual process. Dates can be changed. The non-resident parent can ask for the dates to be delayed, and there's just a series of events. A judge could change a date. There are various delays that can happen throughout the period. They can send a case back to have the details on the accounts checked and things like that. If we move to the administrative one, that will all be done in-house, so any communication with the non-resident parent will be direct with the service. All the checks and balances around the accounts and everything are done obviously prior to a liability being drawn up. That will continue, but we will have a much more direct route to the non-resident parent and eradicate the sort of court type delays that you see in any court process. In terms of will it improve collection, obviously that's our aim and our hope that it will. Again, because the process is delivered direct from the service. At any point, if the non-resident parent engages with us, we can stop that process and enter into an agreement to re-engage with compliance and to start payments again, or to initialise payments. So to answer the question directly of will it improve collection, I can't actually give a direct answer to that. But it will improve the process, and it's hoped by improving the process that we're more likely to get engagement from the non-resident parent and therefore compliance.
Just on then, just to get clear around the courts, is within the courts at the minute and the process, how successful has the courts been?
Well, no, and so the courts.
Are they successful? Has the courts currently been successful?
The courts produce the liability, or yes, they will give us the liability order. They will set out the liability order. That then goes, that allows the child maintenance service then to go to the enforcement of judgments office and use the powers there to try and recover funds and again, look to see the Enforcement of Judgments Office can look to recover assets through JO. They can do charging orders, or it opens up other powers that Child Maintenance Service have the power to use to try and gain compliance as well. It
would be useful to get an insight into how successful it's currently been
give you maybe
through.
Some stats.
So you're comparing we like, obviously, you won't know regarding this new process. Hopefully that it will improve the services, but it'd be useful to get that baseline. I suppose that's one thing.
Yeah, that's
and
right.
I suppose
We actually can give you, we have some figures up until the
very
end of
good.
December 2023. We took forward 218 liability orders, which brought in just over £1 million. So obviously when we go to the administrative liability order, we'll be able to see the differences, how that actually, if it does actually improve. We're not expecting significant numbers because it obviously is the small numbers that we currently go, but yes, we can do a comparison between the court-based approach and this obviously new administrative liability order approach. We'll be able to make that comparison, but the key here is obviously it'll speed up the process of getting that arrears. So for example, I've mentioned just over £1 million. If we did 218 administrative liability orders, that 1 million would be coming in quicker and going out to the resident parent or receiving parent. Just you mentioned earlier about same legal basis of a liability or administrative order. Yes, obviously if we're bringing this forward through the bill, the administrative liability will still have the same legal basis as the current liability order. It just obviously is a quicker process for the child maintenance service.
Okay, so it's about speeding up the process.
Absolutely, yes.
And I suppose it's just a concern, obviously, you had mentioned some of the delays through the court system, but some of those delays may be genuine delays with regard to the non-resident parent, in the sense of, I suppose it's about using your judgment and given the experience internally within the department.
Absolutely.
It's about how both parents can engage even prior to having the likes of an order in, because that's kind of the last thing you want to do. It's how both parents can work cooperatively, and that would be the ethos of it as well, I'm assuming. Yeah.
Absolutely. And at any stage, this is very much the end of our process. And at any stage, even when we reach this process, if the non-resident parent engages with us, we can stop these more stringent enforcement processes at any point, and through cooperation.
No, thank you. I'm just going to pass you over to Cyan now, who's online.
Yes, thank you very much. Listen, anything that can be done to reduce both the administration of this process, but also any delay in the parent with custody receiving the maintenance is absolutely to be welcomed. I have a couple of questions just in terms of capacity of the department to roll this out. Will this create any significant resource pressures? Will there be training for staff? I'm just wondering how different this process will be to what they're currently engaged in. Then the second question is just, has there been any engagement with Department for Justice and Court Service around this change, and what has that engagement entailed, or any feedback? And then my last one is just it's actually something that's been brought up to me in terms of a parent with custody who has been a victim of domestic violence, who may not actually want the department to issue an order against, and if the non-resident parent has been an abusive ex-partner, and that reluctance can stem from fears that the order might lead to further repercussions, potentially kind of preferring to receive less financial support rather than risking any further abuse. And I'm just wondering, the bill uses the word may. Are there any circumstances where the department would decide not to issue an order in conjunction then, or in working alongside the parent with custody? And are there any ways that the parent with custody can change their mind as the department, as whether the department should issue an order against the non-resident parent should circumstances change? Thank you.
Okay. I'll take the first couple here on the actual logistics of doing this. In terms of resource and pressures and subsequent training for staff to do this, you're absolutely right, and the training will be required for staff to take this forward. We are currently working with our colleagues in Department of Work and Pensions who are introducing the same type of change, and we will work through the process of what that actually means in terms of for our caseworkers, because as my colleague John has mentioned, because of the small number, it is a very small part of our caseload that gets to this level. We don't anticipate that it would have any direct sort of resource implications. The process itself, given the small number that we produce each year, I don't foresee it having any significant impact on resources. In terms of training, we will work with our DWP colleagues to develop the training and ensure that's all in place. If it's okay, I will then jump across to your question around concerns around your parent with care that is perhaps a victim of domestic abuse, and then John can maybe come back to the interaction with the courts. If a parent with care is, or either parent advises us that they have been or are concerned about domestic abuse in any way, absolutely we can stop this process at any time. If a parent with care asks us not to proceed, we won't proceed. There are mechanisms that we have in place insofar as payments going out to a parent with care. We can advise them of non-geographical sort codes and things like that, so that that wouldn't necessarily give an indication of where they're living, things like that. But absolutely, if a parent with care is concerned that enforcement action we take would put them in any kind of jeopardy or sensitive position at all, if they simply just need to engage with us, and we will work with them, but we will never push ahead if they don't want us to. That's not to say, I think you said maybe about changing their mind as well. They could ask us, while the case remains open, we can pursue debt. So they could ask for the case to be paused, leave the case open and ask us not to continue with enforcement action at that time. If they felt they want to engage with us later, then we could do that. We could look at the situation again.
I just pick up on the engagement with the Department of Justice. Just to confirm, yes, we've had obviously engagement with our colleagues in the court service. We continue to have that engagement. We did obviously have engagement with them obviously when developing the bill, and they work very closely with us, and we will continue to have that engagement with them throughout the secondary legislation, which is around potentially the appeals process, etc., which there may be a role for them. That obviously is still to be defined. So yeah, we continue to have ongoing engagement with them. If I also just can pick up on the domestic abuse aspect of it as well, it's just obviously another piece of work that we're involved with. There was actually a UK-wide domestic abuse bill, act, it is now brought in last year, which was extended, the scope of it, to Northern Ireland. We're obviously working with our colleagues in the Department for Work and Pensions along the idea of actually if somebody is on the direct pay and is a victim of abuse, we're working on some proposals that we would work alongside the claimant and look at, for example, there would be no engagement. Direct pay is obviously with two parents are paying the child maintenance between themselves. We would look at actually they would be automatically moved on to the collect and pay, so there would be no engagement, but we're still working through those proposals, and obviously we will be coming to committee actually to provide further information once we've developed those proposals.
Thank you, Chair, and can I just thank you so much for how comprehensive that answer was. It's definitely something that has I think anytime there are children involved, especially when you get to a point of having to get any form of an order to encourage someone to pay, particularly when there has been abuse, it's a really sensitive issue. So I'm really, really thankful for your response to that and how I suppose comprehensively you're dealing with it, and also just the reassurance there that there is the scope to pause this and to resume if and when things are if circumstances change. I'm just wondering, in terms of fees, are there fees there in terms of that? Is there any financial implication for either the claimant or either parent involved with that? And then my last question, apologies, Sarah, is just is there anything different in this legislation than is not currently in place in England and Wales? That's me done. Sorry.
Okay, so in terms of fees, for any type of if parents use the direct pay service, there are no fees incurred. Fees are incurred when we use the collect and pay service. So that's when the child maintenance service gets involved in collecting from the non-resident parent and paying out to the parent with care. very broadly, I can give you the fees for collection are 20% from the non-resident parent, and then the parent with care is charged 4% of the maintenance liability. When you move into the realms of the enforcement, they can vary depending on the type of enforcement, starting from around £30 up to £300, depending on what part of enforcement level it is that we are doing, whether that's deduction from earnings order, lump sum deduction order, or when you're moving into the more serious enforcement areas.
And if I can just add to that in terms of the Domestic Abuse Bill that I was talking about, Domestic Abuse Act, I keep forgetting it's an act of Parliament now. Just to say that obviously there is fees, obviously as Ross has outlined in that collect and pay. As part of our development of secondary legislation, we'll be working with DWP to see should we be looking at those fees. Obviously we can't give any commitment at this stage, but we would be looking at those fees to determine whether or not they could be waived in any way, but that's still policy under development along with our colleagues in DWP. I think the other question was around the same as GB, the same in the bill is the same as GB. Yes, we're obviously bringing forward to maintain parity with our colleagues in the Department for Work and Pensions, so it should be the same across in GB.
Okay, thank you so much. Chair, if it's possible, would I be able to ask for an action just in terms of writing to DWP to, I suppose, put forward our suggestion that if there is a parent who has experienced domestic violence, they should never have to pay to protect their identity or protect where they're living. In terms of a collect and pay, if a parent does not want to have direct engagement with their abuser, they absolutely shouldn't have to pay to avail of that service. I would really appreciate if we could write to DWP and ask for policy direction on this if possible.
And currently, we'll take a note of it and bring that back next week.
Okay. Oh, of course, because we can't make any decisions. Yeah. No problem. Thanks so much, Chair.
Okay, thank you. Brian, please.
Okay, Chair. Thank you for the information provided. Certainly this seems entirely sensible that we would take the measures to reduce the timescale through these, just reading the notes of the administrative liability orders rather than the court-based liability orders. So if we can reduce the timescale from 22 weeks to 6 weeks, and given that I assume there's been no other negative consequences experienced in GB since the Act was introduced there, I presume this system is now in operation. Is it in GB? And
no, the secondary legislation hasn't been brought forward. They're obviously they were due to bring it in very shortly, but obviously the general election has delayed it there. Right. So it's obviously still being progressed through, and obviously we work alongside them with that. So far there has been nothing in those discussions indicated. But obviously, as we move forward to the secondary legislation, again, we'll come back and brief the committee on that if there is anything that is raised. We will also be, we were just about to do a consultation exercise, but unfortunately, the general election hit us as well. But we will be doing a consultation on the bill, so we will see if there's anything that comes from our stakeholders. But the early indications is there's been nothing sort of raised in our early discussions, but obviously we will take account of anything that does get raised.
Okay, so it's not currently live as such in GB, but we will have opportunity maybe to learn from any learnings there before
there is the possibility. We were running a little bit
right
behind, obviously GB, but obviously with the general election they've now been held back, so it's a possibility we might play catch up with them. But certainly there might be a few weeks of a time lag, which we might be able to get some initial learning from.
Okay. And just in terms of the real life consequences of this system, I mean, can you clarify, is it the case that if the non-resident parent is not making child maintenance payments, does that mean that the parent with care is losing out on that money, or does the department or the child maintenance service compensate for the money not being paid by the non-resident parent?
So, if a parent with care, I mean, obviously parents can make their own family-based arrangements, which means they don't come near the statutory service at all. If they use the statutory service, yes, if the non-resident parent is failing to pay, then that's money that does not go to the parent with care. And the short answer is no, the department doesn't directly, through child maintenance, recompense for that. Obviously, through the benefit system, then the parent with care may be entitled. Child maintenance doesn't affect any benefits.
Right.
So they are still entitled to claim whatever benefits they may be entitled to, but child maintenance is over and above that. So in effect, yes, it's money that they don't receive, and the department doesn't pay out in its stead.
Yeah. So obviously, the quicker it can all be resolved, the better.
Absolutely.
Okay, thank you, Chair.
Brian? Melissa?
Fáilte Rove, John agus Ross. It's very, very welcome to see the development just in legislation in relation to this, and making, ensuring that children do receive the maintenance that they need, and that it would become a whole lot less hassle-free as well too, I'm sure, for the care in many respects. You indicated just in your briefing as well that you're in the process of developing an EQIA. At what stage is that at the present time?
It's at a very advanced stage. We're just about to finalise it, and we've been working on that over the last number of weeks. We're just about to finalise it in the department, and obviously then it will be shared with the committee and published. But in our early initial assessment, we don't see any significant issues in terms of Section 75. The only sort of two elements that probably stands out is obviously women are the majority. I think about 96% of the receiving parents or parent with care is women. So obviously it'd have a positive impact if obviously we speed up the process of getting the child maintenance to that parent. And on the male side, obviously they would be predominantly the people who are paying the child maintenance. I think the statistic is around the same, and obviously there would be an impact on them because obviously we're recovering the arrears from them, but however it's child maintenance that has been agreed to be paid, so although it has a sort of minor impact on them, it is actually only really recovering arrears of child maintenance they were entitled to pay.
Just one final one for me, and I suppose it's around the stakeholder engagement. Did Westminster Parliament, did they do an extensive stakeholder engagement in relation to the development? And if so, was there any key challenges or concerns that were raised during that process?
Yeah, they did actually stakeholder engagement, and I can just find my notes on it. There was just a couple of points which we obviously have in their stakeholder engagement. The issues raised, there was two sort of issues raised really. Was one around the sort of appeals process, which obviously is still work in progress, so obviously we'll be taking on board the feedback from their stakeholder engagement, but also when we do our own stakeholder engagement consultation. And I'll just check sorry, I stapled this all in the wrong place. And then the other one was actually really, which wasn't really related in terms of this, but it was a discussion around the shortfalls in the performance of the child maintenance service in GB. So it wasn't really, in some ways, sort of related to it in that sense. But mostly, I say, from our perspective of learning from their stakeholder engagement was really around the appeals process.
I don't think there's any further questions from members. No? Can I thank both John and Ross for your detailed, obviously, presentation to yourselves today. Much appreciated, so thank you.
Thank you.
So members, I'm just going to move on now to item 7 on the agenda, and it's a briefing from Cliff Age Coalition. Members, the briefing paper for this agenda item starts at page 164. you. Thank you, and I'm sorry if you were delayed in any way whilst you're waiting. So just members are just grabbing refreshments. So can I welcome you all? We're delighted to have you here today. And can I welcome Sarah Corrigan, Director of Innovation and Engagement with the Law Centre NI, Siobhan Harding, Policy Officer with Women's Support Network, Johnny Curry, the NI Network Lead for the Trussell Trust, and Stephen Morrison, Policy Coordinator with Housing Rights. So Sarah, I'm going to just invite you to make a brief opening statement, 5 to 10 minutes.
Yes.
And then I'll open the floor to members, if that's okay.
No problem.
Right, thank you.
Good morning. Thank you very much to the committee for giving the Cliff Edge Coalition the opportunity to speak with you this morning and to present our evidence. We're grateful for your time and consideration. I know you have a busy agenda. So my name is Sarah Corrigan and I work for the Law Centre, and I'm here this morning with my colleagues who you've already introduced. We're actually going to take the time at the beginning, if that's okay, to briefly each take a minute to cover a couple of things, and it might help talk through the paper. And I'm going to start with a context piece, just very briefly as to who the coalition are and what we've achieved to date, because the coalition really formed back in 2018, so we're in our 6th year now, and it's a voluntary coalition. It's not funded in any way. It's members of over I think there's 108 organisations now, and there's a working group of 12 of us, and we're all there in a voluntary capacity, and our mandate is looking to eradicate poverty. But just to give a very, very brief history, welfare mitigations were first introduced in Northern Ireland back in 2016, and they were introduced by the executive to mitigate against Westminster's welfare reform measures that were extremely harsh, and they were going to have a particularly pointed effect in Northern Ireland. Now, following a long campaign, there were certain mitigations that have been extended indefinitely. For example, bedroom tax, which you'll know was mentioned in the paper. The loopholes were closed to allow people to avail of certain mitigations that they wouldn't have been able to, and benefit cap was extended until the 31st of March 2025. And there was also, in that piece of legislation that brought in that change, there was also an obligation for the Department for Communities to continue to monitor these welfare mitigation measures to make sure that they are continuing to target and protect the most vulnerable in society. But the reason why we did not stop there and why we have continued to campaign is because there's been a cost of living crisis since. There's been further welfare reform measures in the fact that discretionary support has been cut, DHPs have been cut, there's harsher sanctions. Benefit stats that were released last week as well showed a 6% increase in those uptaking universal credit compared to this time last year. So we're continuing with 3 of our key asks, and if you will allow us just very briefly for my colleagues to deal with each of the 3 asks that we have. And we've tried to be very pragmatic in our paper and provide recommendations actually that some of them don't cost anything. And some of them we can implement straight away, and others there are things that need done, but we've tried to give reasoned and pragmatic reasons. And I'll now pass over to my colleague Siobhan to talk about our first ask, which is resolving the 5-week wait for universal credit.
Thanks, Sarah, and thanks to the committee for the opportunity to speak to you today. So, as you'll know, the 5-week wait is often the biggest challenge that claimants face with universal credit, and it has led to widespread evidence of claimants going without food, heating and getting into debt to cover essential bills. The House of Lords Economic Affairs Committee said the wait entrenches debt, it increases extreme poverty and harms vulnerable groups disproportionately. And we have research here by Ulster University which has found that universal credit was repeatedly described as a driver for illegal lending, particularly around the harm caused by the 5-week wait and government debt deductions from benefits. So part of my work with Women's Support Network has involved researching the impact of the Universal Credit 5-week wait with local women, and this research found that almost all of the women reported negative impacts due to the 5-week wait. Many needed to borrow money from family and friends, 61% of them, or lenders, 25%, to survive. 42% reported getting behind with their bills. 53% had been forced to cut back on food or essentials to make ends meet. And 89% reported suffering stress or anxiety as a result of the wait, and that's something we see very much as part of that whole mental health impact. In terms of the help available to get through the 5-week wait, the research showed that 58% of the women had applied for an advance payment, but that 42% were experiencing difficulties paying it back. As part of the original mitigations package, a Universal Credit Contingency Fund was set up to provide non-repayable grants to cover living expenses where financial difficulty occurs during the wait. Our research showed that 86% of the women we spoke to had not heard of the Universal Credit Contingency Fund. Cliff Edge endorses the recommendations made by the review of welfare mitigations, which include increasing the budget for the contingency fund, changing the fund's name to new claims payment, and more active promotion of the fund by the Department for Communities. Ideally, we would like to see a longer-term solution to the 5-week wait involving its mitigation or removal. The 5-week wait is particularly dangerous for low-income families and for women, who often act as shock absorbers of poverty in the home, shielding their children and other family members from its effects. So I just want to finish off with some quotes from our research from the women which show the impact of the 5-week wait. Universal Credit has put me into debt. At no point before this was I without electric, wondering how I was going to feed my kids for the next few days and sitting with no heat. But now with Universal Credit I am. If I had known about the contingency fund, that would have really helped me. Now they're taking £75 a month off me and I'm really struggling and getting more and more in debt. Thank you. And I'm just going to pass over to Johnny.
Thanks, Siobhan. Good morning, everyone. Work for the Trussell Trust. We're an anti-poverty charity that supports a network of food banks across Northern Ireland. I just want to talk very briefly about the 2-child limit. It's important to view the 2-child limit policy within the prism of Northern Ireland, as the particular unfairness of this policy is all the more stark when you consider the average family size in NI is larger than GB, with 21.4% of families here having 3 or more children compared to 14.7% in the UK. It means the loss of £3,455 per child per year for the third and subsequent child. The End Child Poverty Coalition recently released new research which shows that more than 45,000 children here in Northern Ireland live in households impacted by the 2-child limit. The research also reveals that 16% of those children in West Belfast are impacted, followed by 14% in North Belfast, 11% in Uri and Armagh, and 11% in Foy. That's just a flavour of some of those statistics. And as the policy applies to children born after 2017, every year more and more families are affected. A lucid talk poll carried out by Save the Children NI revealed that 64% of the Northern Ireland population believe the 2-child policy is either very unfair or unfair, and 60% are in favour of abolishing it. Something our members often say is that the government doesn't limit access to education to the first 2 children in a family. It also doesn't limit access to the health service to the first 2 children in a family, so it shouldn't be applying this limit to social security benefits. We released a statistical report last week from the Trussell Trust around food parcel use, and the majority of support provided by food banks here in NI is for families with children, nearly 3/4 of support, which is significantly higher than the UK average. And for families with 3 or more children, they're especially likely to face severe hardship, with 37% of parcels provided by food banks in the last year being distributed to families with 3 or more children, which is again higher than the UK average of 30%. And since 2018-19, the number of parcels provided in NI for families with 3 or more children has increased by 127%, which is a huge increase. I'd like to just highlight a recent report by the Institute for Public Policy Research, and some of its key recommendations align with our asks. So to protect households from debt, address the 5-week wait for income at the start of a claim. Backdating rules should be reformed so that financial support is payable from day one of a claim. And then secondly, remove the 2-child limit and benefit cap, which arbitrarily cap benefit entitlement with no regard for the costs families face. The Welfare Mitigations Review report has recommended mitigating the 2-child limit through the introduction of a welfare supplementary payment called a Better Start Larger Families payment, and removal of the limit was also recommended in 2020 by the Expert Advisory Panel tasked to develop recommendations for the as yet unpublished anti-poverty strategy. We know that in April there was an Opposition Day debate on poverty which included a motion on removing the 2-child limit. That's one of the Coalition's key asks to alleviate poverty. We were, however, disappointed that while there was consensus in the Assembly on the damaging impact of the policy, that stronger actions and timelines weren't agreed to remove this policy. The motion on the 2-child limit called for the Minister to present a plan by the end of 2024 on steps to remove the policy. However, a DUP amendment removed this and instead called for the Minister to consider the merits of a Better Start Larger Families payment. It must be noted, however, the merits of the introduction of a Better Start Larger Families payment had already been costed and recommended by the Welfare Mitigations Review's independent panel in 2022. In light of this, the Cliff Edge Coalition is asking that the Executive does 2 things urgently. Firstly, produce a plan and timeline for the implementation of measures which would fully mitigate the impact of the 2-child limit. And secondly, produce a report on any barriers to removing the 2-child limit, including financial and IT implications, and how the NI Executive plans to overcome these barriers, including timelines. Food banks are stepping in to mitigate the impact of this policy. That's churches, community groups, volunteers, and the general public through their donations. That's a huge burden on civic society that needs to be lifted by more compassionate policy making that addresses the 2-child limit. I'm going to hand over to Stephen for our third ask.
Thank you. I'm going to talk about the third ask, which is establishing a financial inclusion service to help low-income private renters in Northern Ireland. So over the past decade, cuts to housing benefits in the private rented sector have made it increasingly difficult for low-income renters to keep their homes. The impact of the cuts can be evidenced by the fact that there are significantly more households at risk of poverty after their housing costs in the private rented sector than there are in the social rented sector, and the loss of rented accommodation remains one of the top 3 causes for homelessness in Northern Ireland. So there are currently 59,000 private renters in Northern Ireland in receipt of housing benefits or universal credit housing costs, and around 50,000 have a shortfall between that and their monthly rent. The average shortfall for those on universal credit housing costs is £129 per month and £97 per month for those on housing benefit. Despite the recent welcome realignment of local housing allowance to the 30th percentile of private rents, there will remain a significant shortfall for many, and that is not guaranteed that it won't be frozen for another 4 years again, like it has been done previously. Meanwhile, rent inflation is showing those signs of slowing down, remains at roughly around 10%, and that will continue to tick along on a monthly basis. With a social housing waiting list of 47,000 households, the private rented sector is increasingly relied on to support low-income households, and this is reflected in the shift in demographics in the sector. And this is also an example of how those who are most vulnerable, these 3 asks can overlap for. So 45% of single-parent households were living in the PRS, which is a group who are disproportionately impacted by poverty. To the Assembly's credit, there has been welcome protections from in terms of social security, and especially in terms of the welfare mitigations around the bedroom tax. And the Housing Executive and housing associations have also designed effective infrastructure of support to help tenants deal with changes to social security, as well as building up strong working relationships with social security staff in order to help tenants access support. But no such safeguards exist for private rented tenants, and what support there is available for them is ad hoc, so discretionary housing payments, which themselves have been limited and rolled back in the past year. So what we are proposing is that a fund be set aside within a strength and mitigation package for a specialist comprehensive financial inclusion service, which would help private renters who are impacted by local housing allowance shortfalls to address the affordability issues that they face. The service would also include access to a grant to meet the most pressing need, which isn't met by current existing support. So the key principles of the service would be its independence. It would be important that the service is delivered by an independent organisation, given the role it will play in advocating on behalf of tenants and challenging adverse decisions. It should be client-centred, and the service should be able to help people find a lasting solution to their affordability issues. It should be specialist, because the specialist nature would enable the service to act as a one-stop shop for struggling private renters, and it should be both accessible, particularly for communities in particularly for rural communities, and it should be efficient, ensuring tenants can access the advice and support they need in a timely manner. So in terms of the key functions of what we're proposing, there would be pre-tenancy affordability checks. When this were applicable, would be carried out where the client is moving to a new private tenancy, which would be more suitable to ensure that the tenancy they're moving into is affordable in the long term. Income maximisation support, such as completion of benefit checks, identification of other relevant benefits, discretionary support, and benevolent funds. There should be a financial capability support and debt counselling. This should be online and both face-to-face in order to maximise accessibility. And this would help with budgeting, prioritising spend, minimising expenditure, accessing financial support, one-to-one debt counselling, and things like liaison with creditors, comprehensive assessment of potential solutions and identification of sustainable repayment plans. And there should be a mechanism for identifying additional support needs and signposting to other services. So referral to external agencies for additional tenancy support or special assistance with mental health or additional support needs. There should also be grant support, and access to the grant should be through referral from the Financial Inclusion Service only, and this is for a number of reasons. To ensure eligibility for other forms of assistance have been exhausted first via the income maximisation and benefit check process, and to ensure the tenants also receive relevant and appropriate support which may prevent the situation where they would need to access an emergency payment arising again. And it would remove the need for tenants to make a separate application to the grant, thereby preventing tenants from slipping through the net or having to go from pillar to post to find help. There is precedent for this. The service grant connection would be broadly similar to the approach that is employed by some larger housing associations, which in addition to providing budget and income maximisation, as well as referrals to debt advice support, also launched a tenant support fund, and the support fund can be accessed by staff while providing the assistance stated above for effective tenants. The payment of grants, the grant payment should be amount not exceeding £500 per client, and consideration should be given to ensure that grant payments are made in such a way that tenants' income for the purposes of their benefit entitlement is not affected. The administration should be administered by an independent non-governmental organisation, and should be separate from organisations which provide help and services in terms of homelessness as well, because there would be an obvious conflict there. And should be administered by an organisation that has experience in giving to individuals on a similar scale. In terms of costing, it's estimated to cost approximately 2.8 million for a year, and this has been costed by the Independent Welfare Mitigations Review. They recommended allocating 3 million to the service per year, and that would be £3 million, which has the potential to potentially save thousands of people a year from becoming homeless, and especially considering within a policy context which we're seeing at the minute in terms of moving toward homelessness prevention, this could be a vital avenue for preventing more people in the private rental sector who are struggling from losing their homes and becoming homeless.
Thank you very much. Really, really comprehensive briefing that you did provide us with, and with the updated information as well. I really, really appreciate that. And I know we says 5 minutes, but I really wanted to hear from each of yourselves, because you are very much specialist experts in the field, and I have liaised in the past with yourselves. And just on behalf of ourselves, obviously the coalition itself does such valuable work in ensuring key issues, because you are on the ground working with the local people and bringing them forward, not just to yourselves, but also this institution and to the general local public, So really appreciate all the fantastic work that you are doing. I'm going to start off with a couple of questions and then I'll open it to the floor. Is that okay? I suppose initially you may have heard of the initial briefing we had this morning with the department and how challenging the budget actually is. So I suppose it's just that there is a reality as well regarding what we're facing and challenging, juxtaposed against what we're here today, and some of the most vulnerable people living in really difficult circumstances. Regarding the 5-week universal waiting list, we've heard today obviously of the welfare mitigations budget for 24-25, including an increase in the universal credit contingency fund, which you mentioned previously. A lot of people didn't even know about. Do you consider that 5 million figure suggested for it would be suffice based on your current experience of particularly women, as you say, are the main ones that it's impacting on? Then secondly, the 2-child limit. Just could you elaborate on that better start? Larger families payment within the proposal, within the welfare mitigations budget, and the budget that was kind of put forward for that, just to remind ourselves of that. And then the local housing allowance. And obviously we all very much welcomed the increase to 30%, but we're conscious that there's still a huge amount of families impacted by it, and it shouldn't be a one-off. And I know as members of the committee we've raised that, and we want to ensure we should be on a regular basis highlighting the fact in Westminster and our equivalent department, the WP, that it's critical, that it's constantly reviewed, and we don't want to be seeing it frozen again. So maybe just with regard to the budgetary adjustments on that, just a wee bit of more information on that as well. So that's just them 3 areas, and I know there's other questions that members may want to ask.
I'll maybe take the 5-week wait one then. And I take your point about the budgetary pressures that obviously all of the departments are facing at the minute, but I think that some of the things that we've presented across the asks don't require a budget. So there are some actions that can be taken in there that could help to make a difference for people. In relation to the 5-week wait, like the name change that was mentioned quite some time ago, contingency fund means nothing to anybody. It means nothing to me. It makes it opaque. It makes it out of the reach of ordinary people to know what that means. It also, makes it opaque for the like of advisors. If it makes sense, then it makes sense, basically, and it's easier, to get across what it's for. In terms of the budget, it's currently 2 million, and the Welfare Mitigations Review advocated for it to be increased to 5 million. At least, I think, was the words put after the 5 million figure. In terms of whether that will meet demand, I can't answer that, but more and more people are being moved over, are being migrated onto universal credit. I think the demand is definitely there, but there's a big piece to be done around the promotion of the fund. If people don't know it's there, they can't access it, and that is a major worry. And if the promotion goes up, obviously, then more people will, access it. In terms of, what that means in terms of how many people are, migrating over, and whether that will cover it or not. I don't have access to figures, but I certainly think the fund is underused, and lots of people don't know about it.
And then the 2-child limit.
Yeah,
the Better Start Larger Grant Programme. Yeah. Against obviously removing the 2-child limit, of course, but just give us more detail on that.
I'll maybe start on that, and I haven't got the details of the full Welfare Mitigations Review report here, but I mean, our kind of key ask is that the detail on that payment, which has been costed and recommended by that panel, needs to form some sort of report on the department's thinking around where that filters into what the implications of that will be in terms of how the department is going to address the 2-child limit. So we could get into the detail of how much that costs, but we know that the detail is already there. Haven't got it to hand, but for us we really need some sense of progress in terms of how that's being considered by the department and part of the overall thinking in terms of mitigating the 2-child limit. I'm not sure if anyone else wants to say anything on that. I think Sarah.
I might just follow on, Johnny, and as well, Ciara, your comment about the budget. Absolutely. I mean, there's a need for real pragmatism, and there's a need across society. I think a starting point for us all is that the cost of not doing anything when it comes to poverty. So I know there's an unenviable task of balancing things, but when we look at the actual cost of what child poverty is in Northern Ireland, and then what the cost of introducing mitigations are, if we don't address poverty, there's going to continue to be issues across health, education, justice. So that's the kind of the underpinning rationale for all our asks. I completely understand the pragmatism, and we can provide more information to the committee in relation to the actual costings of that. I suppose we were slightly disappointed on the opposition day because we felt that the amendment that was actually passed was taking us back a step to go back and consider the merits again of that, when an expert panel had already considered the merit of it. So we supported the unamended motion, which would have put a bit more of a time frame before us. So and that could have taken into consideration, pragmatism, budgets, absolutely, but we wanted something that with teeth that we could kind of hold on to and wait for a report to actually see something happening. Now, it was mentioned several times in the opposition day as well about IT systems, about how much that would cost, and that's a bit of a mystery to us about the technicalities with the system. That's why we have asked, what are the barriers to actually, it was told that, well, we couldn't remove the 2-child limit, or we couldn't actually do A, B and C because it would cost too much within the IT system. But we wanted to know, post the opposition day, we were like, can we know a little bit more about what that means, what the technicalities are? Because, welfare supplementary payments have been in place for other things like bedroom tax, so we didn't understand the difference necessarily, but certainly we can provide more information in detail if you want around the Better Start payment.
Oh, that's fine, Sarah, and obviously we don't have a quorum here today, but it's something obviously I would propose as a committee that we write to the department and get that finer detail, because you need that clarity.
Yes.
And it's about working collectively together.
Yes, absolutely.
To make that difference. So we'll bring that back to committee next week, that proposal, if that's okay, yeah. And just on the local housing allowance, now you did go into detail, and I think it's about reiterating that. What was the number you says again regarding the shortfall in rent? Did you say around 50,000 private
of people?
Yeah.
So
and then it's that universal credit on average £129, and then housing benefit on average £97.
Yeah, so those are the latest numbers. They were provided to in response to AQW by Daniel McCrossan. The last date there was November 2023, so that's the most latest numbers we have. There you will see a difference in terms of that potentially closing when it comes to figures starting from April this year because of the realignment. But if you look at rent inflation over the past 4 years, people are paying on average, an extra £1,600, £1,800 per month in terms of their private rent. So you're still talking about a real terms cut on 4 years ago compared to now. So it won't be sufficient to cover shortfalls for everyone. Meanwhile, rent inflation is showing no signs of slowing down. So you're kind of just taking a step forward, but we're going to start moving back again. In terms of the local housing allowance, I completely understand that is a matter for Westminster. Whenever the original policy was introduced by the Conservative government, it was at 50%, tied to the 50th percentile. That has obviously since been scaled back to 30% and frozen in a number of occasions. So it would be much appreciated if in the housing sections of party manifestos that there was support for moving that back to the 50th percentile. There is similar people, private renters in England are facing similar struggles to private renters here in terms of affordability. So there is a potential to build some like cross party support. But just bring it back in terms of mitigation and what can be done here. While our influence in Westminster might not be to the same level as what the Tories and Labour hold, we do have powers here to mitigate it in terms of investing that £3 million in a financial inclusion service to help the most vulnerable who are at risk of being evicted or losing their homes and get onto the homelessness with the homelessness waiting list. And if you consider that like £3 million, we are obviously in a stretched budgetary environment. But if you consider that an investment, and what is the cost if those thousands of people who might access this service, what's the cost on their health should they become homeless? What's the cost on their children's education should they become homeless? And that's before you even get into considering the cost of that they're going to go on the homeless waiting list. Most of them will become full duty applicants and be temporary accommodation, and the increasing costs there. So £3 million to potentially save thousands of people a year from becoming homeless and maintaining their accommodation could actually in the long run save you both save the housing executive money, could save the Department of Health money and the Department of Education.
Okay, I have Cyan that's online has questions.
Yes, thank you very much, Deputy Chair. And folks, firstly, I just want to thank you all for the work that you've done since 2018. You have all done more collectively to keep poverty and lived experience of deprivation in the minds of public representatives, particularly at times when Stormont was down. So I just want to put on record my thanks. I'm incredibly grateful for the engagement that I've had with you all in the past. Obviously, all of this is framed in the dire budgetary conditions that we have heard this morning. And I'm reminded every time that we talk about things like this, when we had Les Allenby and he talked about us not all starting from the same place. Some are in lane 8 with their legs tied together. In terms of the 5-week wait, we know that it's wild. My particular concern is that illegal lending is putting power into criminal gangs, and we know that poverty is a grooming tool for exploitation, and with women being particularly disproportionately impacted. So that is of huge concern, and the fact that people have difficulty paying back the method that we're putting in place to support them means that we're getting it wrong. Basically, I would support the change to a new claims payment, I think, to make it transparent and accessible. My question, I suppose, on the 5-week wait is really, how could we mitigate it fully? Obviously, admin delay is one of the key issues that we hear about, and putting in place the checks and balances. But I'm just wondering, are there any suggestions about how that can be mitigated from day one? And then, are there any suggestions really on how communications can be improved from your engagement with those who have either not heard at all of the Universal Credit Contingency Fund? Are there different methods that the department should be putting in place, really, I suppose, in terms of their communication? To move on then to the 2-child limit, I really want to see cross-departmental working on this. I think that we talk so often about how the money isn't there, but as you all have outlined, it's not about how much it costs to do it, it's how much it costs not to do it. And for me, a key kind of jigsaw piece there is that Child Services Cooperation Act, in terms of there is a legislative obligation for departments to work together for the betterment and the welfare of children. Is there anything, I suppose, for me, are there things that we can be pushing in terms of that cross-departmental working, that this isn't then just a notional issue with communities? And Johnny, I appreciate going into the Better Start Larger family payment. I think the latest figures that we had got was that for this year it would be 52.9 million. So obviously that is the key barrier. But I'm just wondering, could you elaborate, I suppose, on any other barriers that you have experienced or that you would have knowledge of to mitigate? And the IT system, we're being told, is the biggest challenge, but we haven't really ever been told the ins and outs of that. It's quite opaque. So that's definitely something I would like to take up with the department for a clear indication of, first of all, what would that look like to create an IT system fit for purpose for mitigation, and how much it would cost. Sorry, I'm rallying through these because there's so many comments. And then in terms of the local housing allowance, that moved to 50th percentile. Stephen, I'm just wondering, do you have any figures of cost of what that would look like? And the other thing that's been brought to me is landlords increasing their rents in line with the realignment. So basically continuing and exacerbating that shortfall. Have you heard of that? I suppose, are there any suggestions that could mitigate against the protections, I suppose, in place for private tenancies are falling short when it comes to that? And my final comment is just that I would really welcome support for rural accessibility for that independent advice, but I'm just wondering, again, I suppose, what would that look like? Apologies, there's a lot in there, but you guys give such comprehensive briefings that it's difficult to keep it to just one issue. Thank you all so much.
Thank you, and I'm conscious, obviously, that was a range of
I know, I'm sorry.
So maybe a minute or two, and then if sure you can even forward a written response to any, you're very much welcome to do that as well to the committee.
I very quickly take the 5-week wait. Thanks, Shan, for your questions. So in terms of mitigation around that, there is the possibility of making the advance payment into a grant rather than a loan, but obviously there are IT implications there, and that may potentially make it much more expensive. In terms of how to mitigate it other than doing that, it would be through the Universal Credit Contingency Fund, which would potentially give the local assembly more control over it anyway, but there are several buts with that. It must be better promoted. It must have an increased budget, and there are issues around the name change. In terms of promotion, you asked about ways to do that. The answer is not just to put it on a website. So if it's just on NI Direct, that's not good enough. The women that I speak to don't find out about stuff from there. So it must be done beyond websites. It needs a lot of the way people find out about these things is by word of mouth, by talking to each other, by talking to the woman who sits beside them in the local women's centre. That's how they find out, because other women they know have accessed it, and that's the best way of getting it out. I appreciate that's difficult. I appreciate it's more expensive, but putting stuff on a website is not the sole answer. For some, possibly, but not for everybody. There was to be, the name change is very important, I think. It's just so opaque the way it is at the minute. But also, in terms of the Universal Credit Journal, the reference to the contingency fund was supposed to be moved up in the text. I'm not sure if that's actually happened, but it would be good to get all of that checked out.
Thank you. I'm just going to pass on now to Melissa.
Margaret, so Fáilte Rove Lig, you're all very welcome. So it's a couple of case dog marks. I have a couple of questions just for you. So we would like to comment that I think it was Pope Francis had said that the poor are always with us. And in fact, the poor now is much more diverse in many respects as well too, and diverse in as much as that it cuts across all classes. And that given just our current sort of economic sort of situation and the likes of it, we know ourselves that at all levels it has to be addressed. Now, in terms of household poverty and alleviating it, what measures would you suggest would be most effective? And then in addition, to ensure sustainability of welfare mitigations, in the north of Ireland, what would you actually suggest there as well, to given just the pressures that that's going to come under in the not too distant future, I think?
You want to go ahead?
Yeah, I'll take the first part of that question. I think that what households need is evidence of a long-term plan and a cross-cutting plan to address poverty, which we know sits there through the potential of the anti-poverty strategy. But if we also look across to places like Scotland, where there's a national plan to end the need for food banks, as an example of one other cross-cutting piece of work that looks at the whole household. There's emerging evidence that's showing that the weekly Scottish child payment is starting to have an impact on food parcel use on households who are accessing food banks. So there's evidence across the different regions of things that can be done. Going back to your point from Pope Francis about the poor always being with us, one thing I like about that quote is it also suggests that we should be close to the poor and be listening to them and hearing what actually they think needs to happen. So voices of lived experience need to be front and centre in terms of any plan to address household poverty.
I might just follow on in relation to about the welfare supplementary payments or what welfare mitigations we feel are needed, there is a legislative obligation for the Department for Communities to present a plan to let before the Assembly before the 31st of March 2025, doing just that. Looking at, it was very clear when they were extended back in 2022 that this is something we need to keep an eye on. So, things change. So, for example, what is the priority? Now, do we need to extend them further? Do we need further protection? So there needs to be that view, and separately, not looking at the social sector size criteria, looking more at things like the benefit cap. I want to touch on something very briefly that was mentioned about the 5-week wait and about communications. We find that the most, if you're talking about that household poverty and how people find out about things, simple things like in bold at the end of a letter about the contingency fund or whatever the fund is going to be called, or even a radio ad, when people are driving in the car to know about the funds, they can be extremely effective. I really would relish the opportunity if we could come back with some written response to some of the questions, because there's so many things important things being raised, especially about the IT system and the cross-departmental working. I don't think we can recommend much more until we know what the barriers are with that system, and probably you can't either, until you understand, because we're witnessing where welfare supplementary payments can be made in certain areas, but we're told it's impossible. And I'm thinking back about COVID payments and things as well. I know things can be done, but until we really know what we're up against, I think it's going to be hard for us all to kind of come through with something pragmatic. And rural accessibility, yeah, absolutely. I mean, when it comes to the financial inclusion, I mean, that's paramount. I mean, with the introduction of universal credit, we talk about a 5-week delay, but in reality, we were talking about this during the week. It's not 5 weeks. In reality, you might see people in your constituencies waiting a couple of months. So practical things that can be done long term. The mitigations review actually recommends that a group could be formed to look at the long term plan. Benefits, there's the ability to backdate a benefit as well. So there's a number of different solutions. But until we know what some of the barriers are that we're coming up against now, it's difficult for us to give further, more finite recommendations in that.
Just to like to comment on that again too, in that one of you alluded to what actually happens in Scotland, and then but the culture is different here, even in terms of family size and the likes of it as well too. And again, as I said, the new poor, I'm thinking in terms of the working poor and that as well, and that very often that they're the very people then too that maybe are reluctant to access some of the services and that is there to support them or to make full use of the benefits that they're entitled to, and yet and all, that maybe they're reluctant to do that, and we always have to think of ways of actually communicating and ensuring and reassuring people that there's no shame in any of this, and it's not there as of their fault as well too, as such.
I think what's happening now is there was a period of time for a couple of months that it was like the perfect storm was being created. DHPs were being cut, discretionary support fund, it was like layer upon layer that really people had nowhere else to go when it came to poverty. So I think it can be that layering effect of all the different cuts. You can look at one, but when you look at them all in total, it can be it's really, really difficult for people to know where to turn to. The discretionary support fund used to be something that, if your washing machine, you needed a new mattress, those kind of outside the normal payments. But I mean, there's massive limits on that now too. So it's a complex problem, but. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm just conscious of time, and we have another member. So Brian, can I open up, and then sure, Johnny, if you want to come in, maybe through Brian's question.
Okay, well, thank you for your paper, and thank you also for the work that you all do day-to-day basis in your organisations to help people in need and to alleviate poverty, and that is appreciated. And you've picked out 3 issues, and that's a very helpful paper, and certainly I'll take it back. In terms of where the executive or the minister provides mitigations to welfare benefits paid from Treasury. Obviously that does come out of the departmental budget, so there is a real cost to that, and we were getting our budget briefing earlier, and the departments had a real term cut, so there's no easy decisions, and we're hearing the consequences for social housing. There's no easy decisions to be made, but it's helpful that you've highlighted 3 particular areas, and as I say, that I'm sure that will be looked at. Just to comment, Militia, I think it was Jesus that said, "The poor will always be with you." Wouldn't surprise me if the Pope quoted him, but I think it was actually Jesus that said that the poor will always be with you, but you won't always have me. I think he was making a spiritual point, but it wasn't certainly.
That quote of mine.
So anyway,
two good men.
Yes, but the original source was Jesus. But anyway, we don't need a sermon on that. So certainly, in terms of universal credit, I mean, I did recently visited my job, local jobs and benefits office, and the staff there did say to me that they do very much flag up the contingency fund, make that, claimants aware of that, and also that people can get an advance payment of universal credit up to half, they told me, and they make people aware of that. But certainly, where that opportunity needs to be highlighted more, that certainly should happen. I think that the fundamental problem is that the benefit is paid in arrears, so people are having to wait for that 5 weeks, to get their first payment, and that is, if you don't have savings, obviously, how do you get by for that period? You need to get finance from somewhere. So the contingency fund, and I suppose those advance payments are meant to provide some support during that period. So certainly it should be promoted. But I was told that they do make people aware of that, but certainly if more should be done on that basis. We had the debate on the Better Start Larger Families payments, and I certainly will follow how that is progressing. I'm happy to ask questions on that as well. And I'm aware in my own constituency work with private renters finding large increases, demands from their landlords, or even in cases where the landlord will say they're selling a house, quite frankly they want to get rid of a renter and then they don't sell it. Circumstances like that. So support is needed to cover the scale of private rents, but there will also be a limit to what the benefit system, to the level of rent that can be covered. And I know you talked about that pre-tenancy affordability checks, so people to try to prevent getting to a situation where it is going to be unaffordable rent in the longer term. But no, I have no particular questions. But thank you for the paper that you've provided. Okay.
Thank you. Johnny, do you just want to come back in just?
Just a really quick point about access. 33 people accessed, sorry, over 33,000 people accessed food banks in Northern Ireland for the first time last year, of a range of different backgrounds, but something that has really come through very strongly in our research. So we produced a report last year, Hunger in Northern Ireland, and a very stark fact for us was that 40% of people coming to food banks had received no prior advice or had accessed any advice services. More of our food banks are piloting financial inclusion services within their food banks so people can get access to that financial inclusion advice sooner. So there absolutely is an issue around information and access to that support when people need it most.
Okay. Well, thank you, particularly on behalf of the committee members. Really, really appreciate you taking time here today, because I know you are very, very busy working, doing invaluable work, supporting our most vulnerable. So we want to thank you, each and every one of you and your organisations and all members of the Cliff Age Coalition, for their valuable work that they're doing. And I suppose just on a personal basis and on behalf of Sinn Féin, we very much support the continuing and improving the mitigation payments towards. We do have a challenging budget, but very much supportive of those actions, and it is about how the consecutive can be working collaboratively together to negotiate a better funding settlement first and foremost. I think that's key. but likewise, obviously, the ongoing work, whether it's, you know, the 2-child limit, whether it's working liaison with DWP on that, the local housing alliance with Westminster and stuff. We need to, as an executive as well, I believe, work strenuously and closer together to try and ensure that the voices of our most vulnerable and our citizens, and as you say, it crosses all, it's working parents as well that are absolutely struggling, that their voices are heard, and that lived experience is heard, and we continue to work collectively together. So just once again on behalf of the committee, thank you very much for taking time out of your busy schedules today, much appreciated. And obviously feel free, any further questions that have been raised and you want to provide more detail, we would really appreciate that as well.
And
bring that forward to the committee.
That to the clerk, is that okay?
You can indeed, yes.
That's great. Thank you very much for your time and consideration.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Yeah.
Could this is here and we can note them, but we can't agree them if there is anything else. Can do 8, 9, 10, 11.
Okay. So members, just in the absence of a quorum at this today, I would propose then that as we cannot make any proposals, that we would defer and just move on to item 14 if members are content with that.
Okay.
Likewise, or if there's any proposals just from today that you want to have noted, and we can bring them back. No? Okay. Anything? Okay, thank you. So item 14, so it's just for the date, time and location of the next meeting. So our next meeting will be at 10 a.m. on Thursday the 13th of June 2024 in room 29, Parliament Buildings, and the meeting is now adjourned.
Good.
Thank you.
Committee Room 29, sound. 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 Committee Room 29. Sound. Committee Room 29. Sound. Committee Room 29. Sound. Committee Room 29. Sound.